Welcome to this podcast, which will focus on de-risking business change. It features a conversation between Henry Umney, Director, Cluster 7, and Scott Balderson, Managing Director, Protiviti. If you want to learn more about some of the issues raised in this podcast, please visit us at cluster7.com.
Hello, my name is Scott Balderson. I'm a Managing Director with Protiviti here in London. I'm responsible for our technology consulting practice. I've been working in consulting for just over 20 years and been with Protiviti just over 12 years.
Hi, my name is Henry Umney. I'm a director at Cluster 7. Been with the business for over 11 years and have had about over 25 years experience of software sales into the financial services marketplace.
2017 is expected to see healthy M&A activity, especially in the banking and financial services sector, due to the European Central Bank encouraging cross-border diversification and consolidation, potential relaxation of the regulation in the US, and disposal of non-core businesses by global banks. Given the potential increase in M&A activity in the upcoming years, what are some of the challenges you think organisations will be facing, Scott?
Okay, so I think there's three areas to look at here on both sides of the fence within the M&A market. When being acquired, I think it's incredibly important for the organisation that is being acquired to establish effective financial controls, and often those financial controls will be in operation over not only core IT systems, but also a myriad of critical spreadsheets that will exist in the business. And in fact, it's the very nature of these businesses that are being acquired typically by larger organisations that they will rely on more immature IT systems and indeed business processes to remain agile and effective in their marketplace. So it's very important to understand which complex and critical spreadsheets we are relying on as key financial controls, the integrity of those spreadsheets, where those spreadsheets exist, so that we can convince the marketplace that we have a well-managed business. The other area I'd just like to touch on is our dependency on key individuals. What we often believe as companies merge together is that there are cost savings naturally through combining processes, merging roles, where often there's an awful lot of knowledge that resides in people's heads. And in that short period of time, it's very difficult to tap into that knowledge. And we have to understand, based on how they operate their processes, based on the spreadsheets they use, how those spreadsheets are designed, and ensure that that knowledge is transferred into the new processes and indeed the new people.
And if I just jump in there, Scott, we at Cluster 7 have had experience, as you say, on both sides of the fence, from both the acquirer and the acquiree. So one example was a company that was looking to float or to be bought. And as you pointed out, the need to ensure or to convince the acquirers or the authorities that suitable controls are in place. And on investigation, they realised that their finance system did rely on a number of quite complex spreadsheets. The interlinkages between them were not understood. The company in question had undertaken a manual process to try and document this. We're finding it quite a laborious, time-consuming activity. With all of these M&A activities, there's also a clock ticking, so it takes things need to be documented in time. So the application of the Cluster 7 technology allowed the organisation to map out and understand those data flows, to understand which people were applying the controls, to be able to put the software around that to show and automate the documentation of those controls and really get them to a position where they were ready to go to market or be acquired. So that was to your first point. Your second point around key man risk, again, probably 2-3 years ago, a company had acquired another asset management firm, and they had realized that there were a number of, I think they'd understood when they'd taken over the company, there was some key man risk. I'm not sure they really understood the extent. And really what they utilized the technology to do was to be able to understand those processes as they were being run and utilize the technology to effectively reverse engineer those processes and very quickly take them under IT control and removing the reliance on that specific individual. I guess to your point earlier, they were lucky that individual didn't leave, but actually the use of technology enabled or speeded up the ability to decommission a number of those files, but also to share the knowledge between other people in the organisation.
Yeah, and I don't think we can downplay the idea of timeliness. Having worked in an M&A function and a corporate finance function in the past, we are under very stringent deadlines. Everything needs to happen tomorrow, so leveraging tools and techniques to allow us to perform that discovery, perform that integrity check-in, allows us to support the transaction and to hit the timelines of that transaction, which actually is also very market sensitive in terms of the value of those organisations involved.
Perhaps the biggest structural reform imposed on UK banks yet, the Prudential Regulation Authority has enforced the 1st of January 2019 deadline on banks with more than 25 billion deposits to separate their retail banking business from the riskier investment banking operations. The Treasury estimates that it will cost banks $3 billion to set up and around $4 billion to run annually. We're aware that ring fencing and structural reform, there are a lot of different considerations and challenges for an organisation. But with regards to data, what do you think the main considerations and challenges are, Scott?
Well, I think there's two considerations here. One is around identifying the common platforms that will be impacted across the organisation. And I think what I'd like to just touch on here is our perception of what a common platform is. Traditionally, a IT management, a technology professional would describe a platform as the database, the application, the infrastructure supporting that platform. Let's take a common platform like SAP. Well, actually, in our view, the biggest risk here, a platform could be described as not just the traditional descriptions I just made there, but also, more interestingly for us, the myriad of spreadsheets, models, and desktop-based databases that interact with that platform in terms of exchange of data, reporting, updating transactions. We all know processes are far more complicated in the real world, and therefore there's a huge dependency on the models and spreadsheets that interact with the platform for it to be effective. So that brings with it significant challenges around dividing that platform, understanding what those spreadsheets and models are, how they will continue to interact with the platform, if indeed they're even needed, and what are some of the efficiencies that can be implemented into the segregated platform. So that's a real challenge for organisations. The second piece is really around understanding how the different processes will hand off to each other in terms of what was traditionally a straight-through process. What will that process now look like once it's been divided up, and how will it interact as it goes into group consolidation, central reporting, and therefore the inherent risk that poses a bank as well. So really just trying to understand what we've got out there, how the data flows through the processes, how the data will flow through the processes in the new world, and realising that traditional platforms aren't what they are. They are much more complex than we will ever realise.
I mean, that's interesting, Scott. I mean, your first point around understanding the current landscape, often some of those key processes that are reliant on spreadsheets and users to interact with them are known. A lot of the time they're not. And the traditional approach at looking at that, and maybe you'd like to comment, is manually trying to assess and understand how the data flows through them. And without technology, this can become quite a manually intensive effort or exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think where we're seeing activity in this area, we're seeing traditional techniques used in understanding and documenting the end-to-end process. And absolutely, that's a critical thing to do. But we need to be very cognizant of the fact that through that process, and indeed the associated controls that operate within that process, it's likely to cover, just to put a number out there, 80% of the transactions that flow through that process. It's very difficult without technology and tools to identify what the other 20% of transactions are doing. And therefore, whilst we have a good understanding for the majority of the transactions, there's still the outliers. The transactions that actually generally, historically, could cause the biggest issues. And how do we control those transactions, and how do we process those transactions, I think is really important. And to Henry's point, without discovering and understanding the tools that are out there to do this, you can only be 80% effective in what you're doing, and therefore you're exposing the organisation to significant risk.
To give you some metrics around that, we ran a project with when Scottish Widows was disentangling itself or being sold off from the Lloyd's platform, very similar to a ring fencing program, and they utilised the technology to, exactly as you said, Scott, to actually understand for each of the desks that they were trying to disentangle themselves from the Lloyd's environment, what it is they need to do. And part of that process, which will be the same in the ring fencing, is actually proving to the regulator it took the right data, the right amount of data, and just from a compliance perspective, but then from an operational perspective, from the 1st of January 2019, from a ring fence perspective, when the access to the mothership is cut, making sure that those desks are performing correctly, those processes do run. And as part of that process, Cluster 7 was used as a project resource to automate that discovery, that understanding. Static analysis that you do manually could change tomorrow. We make changes to spreadsheets, and not understanding how that change will affect our program of ring fencing or moving a business unit away from that core infrastructure would be nigh on impossible. I don't know if you, Scott, have any other thoughts you have around that at all?
No, it would only just be to re-emphasise the points that you've already made. I think, timeliness once again is important clearly here with the deadline. I also think we just need to be very careful that any discovery exercises we perform, any processes we're documenting, any transactions we're analysing, that we really need to think about how we continue to do this discovery, how we continue to be knowledgeable about how the transactions are processed, and therefore sustainability would always be a word that would be front and centre for any of these types of projects. I think by performing these activities, you are embedding a increased level of control into your organisation, and you should continue to benefit from that increased level of control. So please always think sustainability, and really for me, and in terms of what some of the regulators say as well, actually, for a variety of different areas, sustainability can only really be enabled through technology.
With the EU General Data Protection Regulation, known as GDPR, coming into force in May 2018, the clock is ticking. The regulation demands that organisations demonstrate compliance with the directive in its entirety and be fully accountable for even any inadvertent lapses that occur. So, Scott, I just wonder what areas you're currently focusing on as organisations seek to address GDPR.
So for us, there's three areas that I'll just very briefly touch on. So the first one is something called unstructured data that I'll come to in a second, and where that data is. The second one is how we classify the data, and then the ongoing activities and actions that are required by the different classifications. And finally, it's the operating model. In terms of making this about ongoing compliance, it's not a one-off exercise for a specific deadline. We need to build a sustainable model that allows us to both identify, manage and control the data that our organisation leverages. So I'll just come back to my first point very quickly, and maybe I'll hand off on some of the other points to Henry. But there's the concept of structured data versus unstructured data. Many of you will be aware that structured data typically exists within the core platforms, applications, databases that we recognise. Unstructured data is all that data that exists outside of that environment, and in particular, spreadsheets, Word files, emails, for example, that could or might contain personally identifiable information. I think, particularly in the financial services industry, we've seen traditionally a very bespoke approach to development applications. So even the structured data environment is still hugely complex and not to be underestimated. But where it really is concerning our clients is in the unstructured data area, where you are a global organisation, and over a period of many years you've built up both a historical archive of information outside of core IT systems, but also you have an ongoing and growing legacy of unstructured data elements across the organisation. Trying to understand where that data exists, how to classify that data, and how to control that data is hugely complex and really can only be solved through technology. I think I would like to mention at this point, it's very important for people to understand within their organisations what data is relevant for GDPR. And I think if we look at financial services in particular, then clearly there's a lot of relevance within both wealth management, retail banking, private banking, where personally identifiable information is at the core of their business, with their clients being retail clients essentially. I think in the asset management world, there's certainly an element there that we absolutely need to understand where that PI data exists, but less so, for example, in investment banking. Clearly every bank is different, but really understand what is the data that's relevant to GDPR and how we manage that data. Certainly in the retail banking sector, we're seeing some significant challenges around GDPR, and really at the very outset of their approaches, they are really looking at those tools and technologies that will support them in the discovery, the categorization of in particular within that unstructured data space. And we really are talking about very vast estates here of information, and without tools, it would be nigh impossible. But I think just going on some other points in terms of classification and the ongoing operating model, I think, Henry, I've seen with you guys, Cluster 7, some really interesting practical approaches to this challenge, and maybe you're better placed to reference those.
Yeah, no, thank you, Scott. I guess, as you said, the classification of the structured data is probably easier, although, as you said, not to be sniffed at, with not only in-house developed applications, but with mergers and acquisitions. Most organisations today are probably 5, 6, 7 organisations smashed together, and their legacy systems exist. But I think in the unstructured world, one of the challenges we're seeing is the famous button that exists in most systems, which is export to Excel. So how much personally identifiable information exists on your networks in the common spreadsheet? How many times did your HR system, did someone export to do a reconciliation? So in terms of trying to classify some of that unstructured data, we're seeing our clients utilizing our discovery and analysis, or what we call risk assessment capabilities, to understand which of those spreadsheets do have personally identified information. So that's on the classification piece of the unstructured. But on an ongoing sustainability basis, what we're seeing is people utilizing our inventory tools to build registers of the data assets they have, being able to classify those, and that's a manual classification by the user as to how it sits within that GDPR framework. Where there are spreadsheets, we can automate the analysis to confirm that private information, personally identified information is there. But as you said, Scott, it's not a one-off process. These assets will change. We need to understand whether there are new data flows between different countries, and all those need to be captured. So that recertification process needs to be managed. And through our inventory management tool, you're able to not only capture those assets, report on them, but also capture that recertification process around that to ensure that you are remaining current. You won't be surprised to know that at the moment we're seeing a lot of people trying to do this data gathering and the collation of this on a spreadsheet itself, which is becoming very cumbersome to maintain because you've got multiple people in multiple jurisdictions responsible for updating it, and Excel's not the best place for doing that.
I think for me, by looking at it, investigating innovative solutions to the problem, talking to some of the tools Henry's referenced, I think it's a far easier sell, for want of a better word, into the organisation. GDPR still has that compliance stigma associated with it. If we're coming to the table with solutions that are as simple as possible, as efficient as possible, then your transformation, your change exercise to comply with GDPR will be, there's a far higher likelihood of success. And I think where we're seeing manual processes in place, we're advising our C-level clients that, they're likely to invest an awful lot of money in year 1 and 2, and actually by it not being sustainable, to Henry's point, you're going to be spending that money every couple of years because you don't have an efficient and effective process. So I really would encourage individuals who are responsible for this problem to really look at some of those tools and technologies that are out there, because they do exist. And please don't reinvent the wheel. We are seeing some clients look to build this up from scratch. You really don't need to. There are very mature solutions that are available today. So,
organisations realise that cloud adoption is no longer an option if they're to deliver the convenience-led, innovative digital services that customers demand, and for business efficiency, flexibility and agility to adapt to a constantly changing commercial environment. Many organisations have opted for the private cloud in an attempt to minimise the perceived risk that the wider technology poses in the form of a public cloud model. Henry, I just wonder what you've been seeing in the marketplace in this area.
So we've definitely seen our clients looking to, or having strategies to adopt private cloud. I guess there's a number of things. You talk about the innovation, being able to be prepared, which I'll talk to you, Scott, shortly about in terms of their business models. But I guess there's another angle in terms of the cost savings. The legacy infrastructure costs a lot. Its inability to adapt. So we are seeing organisations trying to adopt the private cloud. Some of the challenges we see from an IT perspective is taking the existing processes and moving those to the cloud. We've had a number of clients whose strategies have been delayed purely because the process they thought they were going to be pushing up to the private cloud weren't just the core systems. So the core systems where they thought the transactions flowed through, they were unaware of the dependency on things like spreadsheets and access databases that hang around those processes that I guess ensure that they work, ensure that the processes are running correctly. Those off-system processes, sometimes known as grey IT, are really not known, and trying to move that core infrastructure to a private cloud and say we're aware of organisations that have struggled by not having visibility of those off-system processes. But I mean, I guess, Scott, there are wider challenges that organisations face beyond just that simple sort of IT issue. Maybe you could talk to those.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point's still very relevant in terms of the wider context, though. I mean, a lot of organisations in today's marketplace, I know digital is a very trendy word nowadays, but technology and what technology can do nowadays is changing industries. We are seeing, whole industries both within FS in terms of some of the blockchain technology, but also outside of FS, embracing technology, end user applications, the ability to develop robotics outside of IT. It's really changing how organisations do business, and we've seen companies fall by the wayside in their industry. We're all very familiar with the Blockbuster video example, not reacting to technology change. And I think in the broader sense, without our understanding of our key processes, grey IT or shadow IT, where we actually have critical dependencies on spreadsheets and models, it's very hard to understand what that transformation will look like and what the dependencies are around that transformation. And therefore, we're talking about some pretty fundamental stuff here. Is our organisation ready for change on a technical level? It's hard enough being ready for change culturally, but if technically we're not ready or we're unaware and we don't know how our business is operating, then it's very difficult to react in an agile way, in a very timely way. And therefore, we need to address that challenge and take the opportunity once again to leverage tools that are available today that allow us to really have that insight and that ability to scope out what real strategic change looks like.
I mean, we do have one example of that, Scott, where an energy company was looking to outsource its trading platform to an outsourced provider. They did recognise there was a dependency on end-user computing, and the outsourced provider was unwilling to take on that trading platform until the client had fully mapped out the end-user computing applications, agreed that those are the ones that were going to be transferred across, and technology was implemented, the cluster technology was implemented to understand the changes the users were making, because they had an SLA to the client around that environment. So, enlightened firms are doing this. They are understanding that they're being able to adopt outsourcing and adopt private cloud, but doing it in a managed and controlled way. I think they're probably in the minority at the moment, but there are other horror stories that we've all heard about, and if you have any specific examples.
Well, we just see, from our perspective, you use the term end-user computing. I think in the new digital age, end-user computing will just get bigger and bigger. We have infrastructure that's available to us through software as a solution models. We've got applications that are available to us. We can develop solutions in an agile way at desktop, be that complex algorithms that are built in spreadsheets, be they robotic solutions that are available through third-party software. But we have to embrace end-user computing. It's how the industry is going. We just need to understand how we control it in an effective way, and I think that will be absolutely critical to organisations as they mature in this landscape. We also have to be conscious that our people within our organisations are embracing this technology. They want to leverage end-user tools and technologies to be more efficient and effective at their job. We have to allow them to do so, but we have to do it in a managed way that's right for our business, and therein lies the challenge.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. We hope you found it useful. If you want more information, please visit us at cluster7.com.